Hello and welcome to Behind the Scenes, a podcast where we talk about the intersection of art, culture, and big ideas. I'm your host, Sean Malone, creative director for the Foundation for Economic Education and creator of the Out of Frame video essay series on YouTube that this podcast is associated with. Here today, as usual, with Jen Mafsanti, director of communications at the Libertas Institute in Utah, and of course, Paul Nelson, senior marketing manager for FEE and our head of social media. How are you guys doing?
Tired. Like, it's legislative session. That's just going to be like my baseline is how tired am I?
Yeah.
Because it's always going to be tired, but some days I'm more tired than others.
When does that, how long does it go?
I believe the last day is March the 4th. So I really only have to get through this month of February, and then I'm largely in the clear there.
Still, that's a lot.
Oh man, last week was an adventure.
Does Utah fit all of their legislative business into one time frame?
Largely. We are allowed to have special sessions, and we are allowed to have once quarterly interim sessions, but with the exception of the special sessions, and we had one at the end of last year because of redistricting. There we go. Words are hard. But for the interim sessions, they don't really pass legislation there. They just kind of hash out certain aspects of future legislation. It's weird.
So I assume, like,
for by and large, yes, all of the legislation gets done in the one session.
So
that's 45 days long.
I assume that like all of Utah's legislators are like part-time then, right? Like they have jobs.
Very part-time.
They do all this stuff. Yeah, That makes sense. Man, so I'm actually I think I'm about to embark on a 2-month period where I have the same general sense of like, how tired am I? Sort of more than anything, because I'm about to buy a new house, which is wild. My wife and I had been looking for quite a while. We found after we sold our old house, in May of last year. And we found an awesome place, and we're going to do some cool stuff, but I'm going to have to do some work on the house before we actually actually move in. And so from when we close, which is going to be basically the day this podcast goes out, to like when we actually want to move in, which would be sort of the beginning to the middle-ish of April, like it's going to be nights, weekends, whole deal, in addition to like all of the work and any kind of client work I might have and like all that kind of stuff. So I am I don't know. I'm looking forward to it, but then also I'm terrified, like mortified by the whole process, because I'm just like, oh no, this is just going to be so exhausting for the next 8 weeks or so, like pretty solidly 8 weeks of just like pure exhaustion. But once it's done, we're going to kind of like fulfill a dream, which I feel like I've had for a while, and my wife and I have had for a while, which is kind of to get the heck out of the city in a big way. And it'll be 5 acres and kind of in the middle of nowhere. Well, not kind of in the middle of nowhere, definitely in the middle of nowhere. I'm probably closer to Alabama than I am Atlanta by the time we move where we're moving. And also I'm going to be able to have a pretty epic workspace, which I'll talk about more once I actually get into the rebuild and all of that. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to it, but it looks like our closing just got moved up. So we're going to, it was going to be next week, but it's actually going to be this week, which is very, very exciting. Hey. So yeah, but also exhausting.
But still, that's cool. Congratulations, man.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So today, I don't know if this is a segue, because I was about to say, speaking of exhausting.
Well, that's accurate.
Even though I think it's a very, very good movie, and pretty much everybody in the world thinks it's a very, very good movie, probably except for Paul, because Paul's, the contrarian always in these episodes, I feel like. We're talking about The Godfather. today. And I want to back up and say, like, probably it's going to seem weird to people that we're talking about The Godfather, just because, we're not talking about, like, new shows. We haven't yet talked about Peacemaker. We haven't talked about, Ozark or any of the stuff that's out now. But it is Godfather's 50th anniversary this year, actually just coming up, I think, in March, right? And it is, obviously one of the widely recognized greatest movies of all time. The American Film Institute lists it as the second greatest film ever made, just behind Citizen Kane, which I feel like we've also talked about. Didn't we talk about Citizen Kane?
Yeah,
we did.
And then like Paul also hates Citizen Kane, if I recall correctly. I actually kind of understand why people don't like Citizen Kane, though, especially and Godfather, I think, maybe suffers from some of the same problems if you haven't seen it, or if you are going back and watching it from a modern perspective and not recalling that it was made in 1972 and that it is it's like a lot of these kinds of movies sometimes are very groundbreaking, and then if you have to go back after having watched a lifetime of movies that it had influenced, then it doesn't quite seem as important or as groundbreaking as it actually was. But, I think you got to remember with The Godfather that almost every trope we have now in mafia movies, probably had its start in The Godfather. And then I was also thinking, like, how many times in The Godfather did they say it's just business, or it's not personal, or
many times. I didn't count, but it was a lot.
And it got me thinking about my Hollywood's favorite trope video from a while back, and I thought maybe that is in fact the origin of that phrase, because it's always like a criminal enterprise where somebody's going, "Oh, it's just business," and it's some horrible crime that's about to happen. But maybe that all came from The Godfather. Have to know. But anyway, so we're going to talk about The Godfather today. We'll probably get back next week and talk about some of the new excellent shows that are on right now. I think there are a lot of shows that we should probably catch up on. Ozark probably being maybe the big one on the list. I'm not really sure. Maybe that one. Maybe there's a couple others that are pretty interesting. They're out right now. But yeah, let's just start. Like, Godfather. Initial reactions. I'm going to start with Jen, because I feel like Paul's going to be contrarian with this. But, like, Jen, what was your, I'm sure this wasn't your first time watching The Godfather.
No, it was not my first time, but it was my second time. I was well into adulthood before I watched this movie for the first time. And I had confessed to my extremely Italian husband that I had never seen it before. He's like, "Oh, we're going to fix this." So, like, I was married with children before I saw The Godfather for the first time.
Wow. Well, my wife had not seen it, by the way. It was her first time watching The Godfather last night.
Yeah, so it's not, like, I get it. It's an older movie. If you're not, like, super into films, there's not a hugely compelling reason to have gone out of your way to watch this movie, in modern times. So I really like this movie. My husband really likes this movie. He's a huge fan of the novel that the movie is based on. And yeah, but at the same time, we have kind of the same mixed feelings about it, because, and I want to make this extremely clear, this movie is about Sicilians, which, especially in the mid-40s, like, the different Italian regions definitely still thought of themselves as separate from each other. And they're still speaking their own dialects and not what we broadly consider to be quote unquote Italian these days. And so a lot of the Italian that you hear spoken in The Godfather is actually Sicilian dialect and not properly Italian. And yeah, so it's a little, like, it's weird, but it's also very good And I really like this movie. It's not something I'm going to go out of my way to watch every single year, but it is quite good.
It is 3 hours long, to be fair,
Yes.
and it's a pretty intense. I feel like it's pretty intense 3 hours in a lot of ways. So it's kind of hard to. It's a hard one for me to come back to a lot, but this is probably I don't know, maybe upwards of 10th time I've seen The Godfather. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say at this point because I probably first saw it when I was a teenager, and then you don't really keep track, but it comes up every couple years, and you end up watching it every few years. Although I will say that clearly I haven't watched it the entire time. With my wife the entire time we've been together, but so that's been a good bit. But yeah, Paul, what were your kind of initial thoughts? And this was your first time, right?
Yeah, a little. This is honesty time. I've never seen Godfather. I've never seen any of the Godfather movies. I don't enjoy the mob subgenre of film. It's weird to me to idolize people like this. So it just never really interested me. So having said all that, this was 3 hours long, and a lot of times I forgive runtime if it's that long. Like if the movie's good, I want to stay in it. I want to be in this world longer, but I just don't feel like this earned my attention for 3 hours. Frankly, it didn't earn my attention for 30 minutes. The opening set piece of that wedding was long, and there wasn't really much of a payoff from it ever. Like the scene where the FBI is out front looking at the license plates, and
right?
They run them off. Nothing happens of that. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Why did you just spend 5 minutes on that? I don't know. Move on to the next.
It's not. As I was saying before we started recording here, like it's not a very efficient movie in a lot of ways. There's this is going to be a very, very, very weird reference because it's not. I mean, there's so many. There's just no way you can really compare these two. But obviously, I just put out an episode of Out of Frame on Demolition Man, and one of the things that I would point out about Demolition Man that I actually really, really love about that movie, it is an extremely efficient movie. You are maybe only 4 or 5 minutes in at most, and John Spartan is being cryogenically frozen, and we're already into the future where he is like, and you've already gotten all the setup you need. You know exactly who he is. You know exactly who the bad guy is. Like everything you need to know about the setup in that movie happens in like 5 minutes at most, right? And it's so tight that it just doesn't waste those kinds of things. Now, that's also a very different way of thinking about film. And of course, like, honestly, I mean, this is a Francis Ford Coppola movie. I mean, this is, if you look at Apocalypse Now is not it's not like a quick movie, right? It's not like a fast-paced, efficient movie. It's a movie about, lingering scenes and emotions and kind of taking your time to get through character change and things like that. And so you've got to know that going in. It's not like a fast movie at all. But for me, it's a very interesting movie, and it's one that does actually, like, from a directorial standpoint, like there's some phenomenal performances in this movie. There are some, I mean, just amazing sequences. Like all of the stuff, like the themes in the movie are so beautifully handled. And in the end, like, I guess we should probably talk about plot a little bit. I mean, the movie is about, well, the funny thing is, because I think my wife went in thinking that the movie was going to be about Vito Corleone, who's the Godfather, played by Marlon Brando. But in reality, the movie is primarily actually about Michael, who is one of his sons. And this is one of the most, I mean, granted, it's a tragedy in a lot of ways, but it is one of the most, like, sort of iconic and like effective, I think, story arcs or character arcs that you'll see in a film. I mean, you have a man who starts off as a war hero, a very above board, very, on the surface anyway, a very good man who over the course of the film gets sucked into being a part of this mob family, and that's essentially the story of the film is Michael becoming drawn more and more and more into the life that his father built, and the question I think for Michael to some extent is like, is that what he wants? Or is that, and there are some really interesting turning points in the film for Michael where he like very clearly makes a choice where he's like, nope, I'm in it now. And there are some moments that he just, there's really no turning back from. And I'm not going to spoil the very, very end of the movie, at least not yet. But I think like thematically, what I will say is like going from your sort of opening image of Michael in a military uniform and also not even part of the family at first, like he's missing from the family photo that they're taking at the wedding. And Vito says, well, we can't take the photo until Michael is here. Right. Like we got to wait for him to be here. And then when he shows up, he's, in full military uniform. He's not really part of the family. Right. Even though he is, and even though family is super important to him, but going from there all the way to what is ultimately the final image of the film, which is Michael. And again, I won't give away what exactly happens, but like Michael says something that just so like aggressively confirms that he is that guy now. That like going from opening image to final image is such a long way that I think from a storytelling standpoint, that's for me at least probably why that this is such a top rated movie always. I mean, just watching that progression of somebody going from hero to, what we should see as a villain in any case. Although to Paul's point, I agree with you. Like this movie does, it does idolize these guys. It makes them really, really cool. And it makes it seem like they're, well, I don't know. I mean, it certainly humanizes them, but it also like kind of makes it seem like it's cool to be a murderous mafia don, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not as egregious on that front as like the Goodfellas.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, and it's not like a bunch of guys going around murdering people and then like, oh, look at how cool we are. It's, and I will say to that end, I mean, like the war that gets started, in the context of the film, you're not going to be surprised to learn that there's basically inter-gang war that is happening throughout the film. Certainly Vito doesn't make that seem like a good thing, right? Michael doesn't seem to believe that the war is a good thing either. None of these guys really want to be, murdering each other in the street. And they all see it as bad for their families, but also just bad for business in general. It's not, it's not very healthy for a bunch of people to bring the law down on them when their whole enterprise is criminal.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is also, I think, a pretty major part of the story that I do think is kind of interesting. Like part of the war really starts when one of the families goes to Vito and asks for a loan or asks for investment money in a drug enterprise. And Vito Corleone says no. And he says no because while he believes that like gambling and booze and prostitution and all of the things that they're selling now, the police are sort of fine with. They kind of look the other way on and nobody really sees it as that bad. But if they start selling drugs, they're worried that Vito's worried, and I think rightly in a lot of ways, that that's going to be the end of their entire business because it's going to be, it's going to result in such human tragedies that people are actually going to get outraged by it and do something about it. So I don't know. I think that's pretty interesting too. There's sort of like this element of, I don't know if it's morality exactly, because I don't think he's rejecting that drugs, necessarily from the standpoint of just being, like from a moral standpoint. I think he's rejecting it more because he sees that as a detriment to the business overall. But that's what kicks off a lot of the inner gang war that ends up happening. And indeed, he ends up being right, I think, to a large extent. I mean, like when the minute that they start going down that road, everything starts to kind of fall apart. So I don't know. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts more. I mean, I think, Paul, from a first-time viewer standpoint, like, what were some of the things that you were surprised by, or things that you, I don't know. I mean, it's hard because I feel like everybody knows a little bit about this movie going in, because you can't avoid it in popular culture to some extent. But
I mean, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
I think what took me back the most was just really just kind of I don't want to, this is going to sound really mean, but the production value was just not that high. There was a lot of weird audio stuff that just didn't sound right. There's a lot of times where the camera work was overexposed, and like underexposure you can get away with, and a lot of times you can use it to further the story. Yeah. But overexposure is bad. Like there's really never a time where you really want to overexpose an image. I mean, very rarely. And the times where it happened, it was basically they were outside and they just didn't control the light very well. But as far as the story goes, what was really interesting to me is that, and this is where it kind of comes into the, out of frame kind of stuff, is that the government, where these people gained power and influence through violence, was where the government was clamping down the most and making things illegal. And it really brings up the question of, who would you rather have the power? These idiots, who are idiots, that just are okay with killing people, or yourself? And unfortunately, that has been answered for us for the most part of this century, or like the 20th century. And this really puts it for me, like I said earlier, these are not sympathetic characters. Like I feel no sorrow for Michael or Vito.
Yeah.
The only people I really feel sorry for are their kids, who are inevitably going to be caught up in this, and through no choice of their own. So it's frustrating, because when something gets prohibited, it's gonna end up giving more power to people that shouldn't have it. And if it just wasn't prohibited by the government, then none of this would be happening.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. So I've had a bunch of conversations with people over the years, and in fact, one I'm kind of having on YouTube right now, where it's always interesting to me where people blame what they claim is free markets. Like they'll use the term free market, and for something terrible that's happening or whatever. And then when you actually look at the claim, what they're really talking about is something that is heavily, heavily government controlled or regulated. And what I think is interesting, that I kind of wish more people understood, or if they thought about it in these terms a little bit more, is that like everything, when you talk about like a state run economy versus a free market economy, what you're really talking about in general is like this spectrum of control, right? Because it's not just like a switch. There's not just like, here's a state run thing or a state controlled thing, and here's a perfectly free market on the other end. I mean, what you have is, full on black markets because the restrictions are really, really severe. But by the way, the restrictions sometimes in some of these things, you see this in certain kinds of drugs and in alcohol and things like that, where they'll prohibit sales, but they won't prohibit use, or they'll just tax sales really, really, really highly. Loose cigarettes being, I think, maybe a really good example of this. If you look at a city like New York City, they tax cigarettes so high that there ends up being a black market for what's called loosies, right? Which, if you guys recall, Eric Garner got killed by the police in New York, I don't know, 5 years ago or whatever. It was longer ago than that. But, Eric Garner died basically because the police kept catching him selling loose cigarettes, and eventually they were going to arrest him, and he died in the process of that arrest. And the but the loose cigarette thing wouldn't exist were it not for the absurdly high cigarette taxes in New York. But it's an interesting thing to me because cigarettes themselves aren't illegal, right? New York didn't ban cigarettes. They didn't just say like outright, this is not allowed. And yet the taxes themselves were sufficient restriction to create a black market. And that's where this kind of spectrum happens. It's like if you fall on the more heavily restricted side of the spectrum, you may end up creating a black market, regardless of whether or not it's, your product or whatever is effectively illegal or technically illegal or technically legal, I mean to say. And I think that like we all look at a mafia movie and we see them running, maybe they're selling guns or they're selling drugs or, alcohol during prohibition or all these kinds of things where it's like a hard line that's illegal and they're selling an illegal product. But man, it's not always that simple. There's a lot of black markets that get created as a result of just heavy-handed regulation, And that's what I wish people understood it more on the spectrum, because if they did that, then I think anyway, or I would like to believe that they'd be less prone to saying that like, oh, this is a free market and it's going badly. Because I think if they thought about it a little bit more carefully, they'd look at something like healthcare, for example, and they'd be like, oh no, wait, this is an extremely heavily regulated market. And so it's got problems. And in some cases, people are going to black market solutions for healthcare related problems. And I don't know, it's interesting just because I feel like there's way more nuance than I think we often give it credit for in that sense. But of course in The Godfather, it's a lot of very clearly prohibited things. Although now you got to ask yourself, like the Corleone family's primarily gambling, right? Like that's they're casino runners. So now you got to like, why? Like why did the government make it illegal for them to operate casinos in the 40s, 50s, whatever, right?
We know what's best for you. You obviously cannot handle yourself, so
you probably get a gambling addiction.
You can't do that. Yeah, I think wherever there's issues in our country, or I guess any other country, but there's usually a reason, and it's usually the federal government doing something, and it's an obvious reaction to the federal government doing something.
Yeah, I mean that's been the longer I've done this kind of work, that's been my experience. It's like, and now because I've done this kind of stuff for so long, and I imagine you guys have a similar thing at this point, is like whenever somebody tells me something is a big problem, like I immediately instinctively go to the law and look at the law and see what it is about it that is affecting this. Because there's almost never been a case where somebody's brought to me something like, hey, this much needed good, like insulin, for example, just really easy examples, like insulin. You're like, why is insulin so expensive when it's, something that we've been making forever and it's cheap to make and it's needed by millions and millions of people? You go, yeah, you're right. That should be like, probably cost the same as a bag of Fruit Loops or whatever, right? Like it really shouldn't be a big issue. And then you go, oh, look at the law. And then suddenly you discover that like all of the reasons why insulin or certain types of insulin in any case are really expensive is because of the law and because of the way that we've set up our regulations around healthcare. But unless you've got that experience, I think people don't instinctively go look at that. They just assume that there's something wrong with the market. There's something wrong with the companies manufacturing this stuff or whatever. But it's like, no.
The government can set the price and fix it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
it's really, sorry. And we've talked about, you talked about the insulin, talked about Eric Garner. Eric Garner obviously was a little bit more locally enforced laws.
Yeah.
But like it's in every part of our aspect of our society. And it's really weird when you start looking through a lot of our cultural issues. A lot of it can be boiled down to laws that are that the government has put on us. I think the Eric Garner stuff is a prime example. And with the conversation went immediately to police brutality when that happened. And I felt like, and a lot of other people felt like, well, why is this illegal in the first place? And you're only just giving cops more excuses to do something and to escalate a situation where, on the face of it, somebody's selling a loose cigarette. Are you kidding me? Like,
yeah.
Really? Like, this is what we're doing?
But the moment you bring that up, you become the jerk in the conversation somehow. I don't know how that works, but it does.
And that interaction should never have happened. And
right.
you can go down a list of issues like this. I mean, obviously, marijuana being illegal is a big one,
sure,
and causes a lot of issues. But I mean, like, even the Dallas Buyer Club movie that that movie that came out a few years back, back to healthcare. It's just, it's really frustrating. Yeah. It's really frustrating.
Well, the right to try stuff, I think, gives you a lot of options to talk about this kind of thing, because it's that whole movement. For those who don't know what that is, I mean, it's a sort of a movement dedicated to promoting the idea that if you're dying, if you're somebody who has a very serious medical issue, like, you should actually have the right to choose for yourself whether or not to try an experimental treatment or try something that is potentially dangerous. When you look at the stuff with Dallas Buyers Club, that was all about a man who's dying from HIV/AIDS, and had literally months to live at most, and so he wanted to get into an experimental medication, and was prevented from doing that because that's what the rules. Them's the rules, and so as a result, what he ended up doing was finding that drug in Mexico, transporting it into the United States, and then creating a private club, selling it to other people. Once again, creating a black market for this thing that that probably should have just been legal and able to be acquired via a doctor, right? Like via a competent medical professional. Here, we do this kind of stuff all the time. Like, this is something that we see constantly, and I'm fascinated by the fact that we always blame these things on greed, even in the context of like the Godfather and mafia movies and stuff like that. You look at them, they say it so often in the movie, right? They're, oh, it's just business. It's just business. It's not personal. It's just business. They say it over and over and over again in the film while they're murdering people and whatever else. But the reality is, it's only a business that they, one, can operate at this level, but two, that they need to operate via violence because of these stupid rules, right? I mean, it's mind-blowing to have, now I think for most of us, we look at gambling and we go, well, millions of people a week or whatever go to Las Vegas and gamble, and they have a great time, they go home, and it's fine. Millions of people play the lottery. Millions of people do, fantasy football. People gamble on stuff constantly. They have, backyard poker games, and they play with their buddies. It's fine, right? Like this is a thing that people do. It's a thing that people do for fun. The vast majority of people do not have a major problem with it. It's not a major issue. It becomes a major issue when you make it illegal. And then when the only way you can go, if the only thing you could do to gamble was go to a bookie run by a mafia don and get your legs broken if you couldn't pay, then yeah, we'd all have problems with this, but you make it legal and that goes away because you don't need that. You don't need to go to that. You've got competitive options at that point. So,
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. There's a scene.
And yet,
oh, go on.
Here we are.
Go on.
I said, and yet here we are.
Right. Well, I was going to say, like, the scene where the other one of the other crime bosses comes in and asks Vito to give him $1 million in cash to start up this drug business. And there's a part of the sequence there is, Vito basically says, yeah, the money's not a problem. I don't want to do, I'm going to tell you no. And I'll tell you why I'm going to tell you no. But the fact that he has $1 million in cash in this case, in the 40s, right? It's set in the 40s. He has $1 million in cash and he can just, at the drop of a hat invest into another business, that there's the reason is because he is the only game in town for certain kinds of things. In his case, it's actually primarily political corruption, basically. Like, so the thing is, we haven't talked about this yet at all. Like, the Corleone family runs casinos and things like that, but their actual business, their core business, and for which they are getting paid by the other mafia families, is political protection and legal protection. Basically, they own judges, cops, mayors. Like, they have politicians in their pocket, and I think that's like, it's pretty interesting to me, because it's like, we always talk about this stuff as if there's, this hard line between politics and like above board and crime, and you're like, no, these guys are all criminals. And
Yep.
Yeah.
And the more you try to, more laws and regulations, the more powerful the senators and congressmen can be corrupted. And I mean, it just follow the line. And it's like, oh, you're going to make a law making something illegal that people want. Well, there's got to be somebody that's going to fill that gap.
Right.
And then the people that are supposed to hold them to account are obviously going to get bribed because it's too much of a moneymaker not to. Like, it's just baffles my mind why anybody thinks these are good ideas.
I mean, it's a very simple formula. If you want crime and business out of politics, get politics out of crime and business. It's that simple.
Yeah.
And yet,
are you guys? I assume you guys are. You're familiar with Bruce Yandel's bootleggers and Baptists idea. Paul, have you ever heard?
Yes.
You ever heard this?
Yeah.
So I don't remember if we ever talked about this on the show before, but the observation. This is an economist named Bruce Yandel. He's retired now, but he's getting up there. But he had this observation about prohibition. Essentially, the people who benefited the most from prohibition, the people who were the most supportive of prohibition, were the people who had religious, sort of objections to alcohol consumption. That would be the Baptists, right? And I would also, like, you'll see, if you use this as a metaphor, it doesn't have to be literally religious. They can be just have that same sort of religious zeal, right? Like, a lot of people have that. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, for example, I think would qualify.
The moral opposition.
It's the moral opposition to the thing. And then you have the bootleggers themselves, who benefit tremendously from alcohol being illegal, because it removes basically all of their competition. I mean, if there's only a tiny handful of people willing to take the risk to, bootleg, to create traffic, sell alcohol and get it to people, they're going to make money hand over fist, where if they actually had a lot of competition, they wouldn't be able to make, massive profits. They may still do very well, but like, they wouldn't be able to do what they're doing. And also, they'd actually have to do a better job. It couldn't just be like bathtub gin, right? Like, they'd actually have to do really, really good work. And that's exactly what we ended up seeing once prohibition was repealed. And then it actually took another, 30, 40 years or whatever after, well, much longer than that, 70 years before we started getting some loosening in regulations on distilling and in brewing. Because it wasn't really until the 80s, 90s, and then now where we were able to start seeing, people other than Anheuser-Busch and Coors basically do brewing. Yep. And now we've got this massive explosion of every possible kind of thing that you'd ever want, and quite a lot that you don't want, if you're me. But
yep.
But that really didn't exist when it was all heavily controlled. Like, it's just such a weird thing to me, because when you look at what the reality is, when government heavily regulated the sale and the production, sale, and distribution of beer, let's just take as one example, there were only two giant companies for decades that were big enough and politically connected enough to be able to navigate that set of rules. And the minute that we deregulated that environment, suddenly there's an explosion, and everybody's doing it. And not only is everybody doing it, it's better. people start winning awards internationally. American brewing companies start beating German beer makers, like they'd start beating people, same thing happened with wines, right? Like wineries started beating French wines and Italian wines, and they're starting to but that's only possible in the deregulated environment. And yet almost every time I talk to people about deregulation, they go, yeah, but if it gets deregulated, there's going to be 2 companies left and it's all going to be a monopoly. And I'm like, no, dude, you've got it exactly the opposite.
Yep. It's got that one backwards, bud.
It's exactly the other way around. And it's the same thing. If you make gambling in casinos illegal, then you've got 1 or maybe 2 mafia groups that are controlling all the gambling, because that's all that the market can take, because you'll get murdered if you try to compete.
Yep.
You make it legal and suddenly there's, innumerable companies and video games and online platforms and whatever else, It's just the weirdest most backwards thing that people have in their minds. I don't get it. I don't get why you don't understand that it is the regulation that restricts that competition and not the other way around.
Yeah. Yeah. And unfortunately, sorry, go ahead, Paul.
No, you could go for it, Jen.
I was going to say, unfortunately, I'm kind of on the front lines of that clash of sentiments right now in Utah. We're really working to dial back occupational licensing in Utah. Utah's occupational licensure laws are pretty strict. It's not an awesome environment. But it's a priority of the current governor and of us, coincidentally, to sort of dial that back. And people get completely bent out of shape whenever you suggest dialing back some of the requirements for occupational licensure. And Sean, you've dealt with this yourself. You've made documentaries on it, but it is wild, the sort of justifications that people come up with for defending occupational licensure, or at least really strict occupational licensure. And it's really, really frustrating. And it's difficult for me to get my head around it, because I do have to get my head around it. I've got to talk to these people. I've got to somehow figure out how to convince them. But it's rough out there.
Yeah. It's really weird for me as a Christian, talking about these things where we see them in a society as moral issues, and it's really, in my interactions with people, it always comes down to, I think people just don't trust other people with their own autonomy.
Yes.
And for me as a Christian, that is fundamentally goes against what I think Jesus is teaching, which is you are the only person that can control your destiny, your eternal life. And taking that to conclusion is giving people, the government is not God. The government can never be God. We have these inalienable rights given to us by our Creator, and putting artificial restrictions on those are only going to allow for worse outcomes. So I really get fired up about this stuff across the board, because I really do think it is I think it's morally wrong, to be frank with it. I think the government has no standing to tell someone what to do with their own body, and when it affects nobody else, we're just creating more problems than there would be otherwise.
That's a compelling argument, Paul. I'm going to write that one down. Thanks.
So I think that people are really, I use this term sometimes, I feel like people are a little schizophrenic about the way that they think about some of this stuff, or in this case, maybe bipolar is a better sort of descriptor, because what happens is, on the one hand, you can get people to recognize that the law is not the same thing as morality. So there are certain cases, right, where people are willing to accept that, like, we should not look to the law to be the arbiter of what's morally right. And sometimes the law gets it wrong and stuff like that. So, for example, if we decided that it was legal, I mean, not if we decided that it was legal, but it was in fact legal to have slaves. It was legal to treat people completely differently and segregate certain groups of people from other groups of people. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we've done perfectly legally that you can look back on in history, and we would now pretty much everybody would look back on it and say, yeah, that's not moral, right? And so you'll see that and you'll understand the distinction. But then at the same time, I have conversations with some of the very same people who would recognize that, who somehow believe that if something is moral, or at least if it's something that they believe to be a moral issue, they want it legislated and they need for it to be legislated. And it seems weird to me that people can't accept that there's a difference between these things. There is what is legal and what is moral. And there are also things that, like, in the public policy sphere that, like, really don't work well when you try to legislate them. A lot of times for reasons that you're trying to overplan, essentially. You're trying to take away choice from individuals, and you end up creating a lot of problems that way. But just because you don't legislate something doesn't mean you accept it or tolerate it or say, like, you're not endorsing drug use.
Thank you.
Right? Like, you're not endorsing drug use by saying it should be legal for people to do that. You can still take it case by case and say, like, hey, I've got friends who use drugs recreationally. They don't have a problem with it at all. And that's fine. And they can do their thing. And then I've got other friends who, over the years have had a terrible, terrible problem with it, and who have actually, needed somebody to step in and say, hey, dude, you can't do this. But it's not the law that needs to do that. It's their friends and family and people who actually care. It's just weird that there's this split to me. Like, we see some things as, if it's a moral issue for some people, they absolutely have to get the law involved. And
yep.
I don't know.
Can confirm.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, the government has definitely marketed themselves effectively.
Yeah.
By making people think that they are righteous, pure, that aren't corruptible type of thing. And
right.
When in reality,
they do that by having a monopoly on education, but that's neither here nor there.
That helps. It definitely helps.
Oh, that going down what I was talking about earlier, education is another thing that really fires me up. But anyway, we can save that for another
day.
But like bringing it back to the Godfather, all of these thoughts were going through my head because I had a lot of time to think about it during this movie because it wasn't a lot of stuff was happening. I was getting. You're just like you're watching Michael Corleone just amble slowly down the streets of Italy, and you're like, I'm going to ponder. You know what? Why are there
criminality?
Why are taxes so high? Why are we doing this? Why do we have?
I totally agree. And the cherry on the cake for me, if we just to spoil things just a tiny bit, at the end of the movie, when Michael is talking to his former girlfriend, Kay, and trying to convince her after his very long absence to come back and marry him, and explaining to her why he's working for his father now. And he says he's like any other powerful man, like a senator or a president.
Good line.
She turns to him and says, senators and presidents don't kill people, Michael. And he looks her dead in the eye and said, who's the naive one now?
Right. Yeah.
Because they 100%
do. Yeah. I mean, it's disturbing, but it's odd to me because, like, the cultural framing changes the way that people think about stuff, and it's very easy for people to accept. It's even weirder to me because it's super easy for anybody to accept that there is a mafia don because we're aware that these people exist, right? Like we know that some of these people existed, a lot of these people existed, still exist, right? Like we know that. So it's very easy to accept the idea that there's some head of a crime organization who's having people killed, right? That's easy to accept. It's also relatively easy for people to accept that that person could bribe and pay off police officers and judges, right? I mean, my wife and I've been going through, I think we talked about this last time, we've been going through the Netflix MCU stuff. And so we just finished Daredevil season 3, which overall is really good. The entire run of Daredevil is really, really good. But the whole thing of Daredevil season 3 is that Wilson Fisk owns every single politician and judge and FBI agents. And he has done such a good job building a network of legal protection via bribes and, getting blackmail and things like that, that he now is basically untouchable. Like literally the FBI will not take him down because the FBI, he's got core FBI agents in his pocket. And we'll accept that that is a thing that happens. And yet somehow if you make the leap to, yeah, and by the way, like American politicians have probably had people murdered, too far, right? We can't talk about that.
Can't say that.
Like that's conspiracy theory.
It's conspiracy theory territory immediately.
You're going to get deplatformed, Sean.
Right. Well, and the funny thing too is going back in the history of all this stuff. I mean, like a lot of early American politicians. I used to have a band that the name of the band was Boss Tweed, based on William Tweed, who was a New York. He was the Tammany Machine, political machine. He was the head of the Tammany Machine in New York, which was a late 1800s, early 1900s political machine. He was a politician and a mob boss, and he definitely had people killed a lot. And I mean, it's like it exists. And it's weird that we are always so okay to tolerate it historically. We're okay to tolerate it in small doses. Like it's okay. A corrupt cop. Okay, sure. But like a corrupt president? No, that couldn't be. A corrupt, senator? No, we couldn't possibly accept something like that. It's very weird to me.
It is very weird that we accept this idea in theory and in small scale, but not in actuality.
It's like it's so shocking to people to even consider that idea. I love that scene.
Humans in the government have ulterior motives.
Right,
what?
Right. Yeah, I don't know. So I think what we're saying as we wrap up this this section on the Godfather is everything that happens in the Godfather that's horrible is actually the government's fault. I think that's
I can support that. Always. Yeah.
I think that's.
I will say I have railed on and on about how the guys in this movie are just absolute idiots, but at least they made a distinction between civilians and actual players in the field, which our own government does not. As the raid in Syria last week that was quote unquote successful, that killed one of the heads and also 6 women,
the evidence is before
6 children. So I mean.
It's an incredible definition of success we've created for ourselves.
Yes.
But yeah.
That's so weird. So, star ratings?
I mean, look, full star for me. I mean, this is I thoroughly believe this is one of the greatest movies of all time. And granted, it is a movie now that is, I think, hard for people. If you don't know how important it is and how influential it is, I get why you'd be a little more bored by it than a lot of movies that have come since. But I can still look back on it and say, like, this started the entire genre, or not started the entire genre, but like advanced it tremendously. So, and also, I mean, some of these performances, I mean, my goodness, Robert Duvall is phenomenal in this. James Caan is great. Like, he's terrible human being, but I mean, like, Brando's performance is iconic. Pacino is fantastic throughout. Like, it's a really, really well directed movie. I do wish it was a little better edited, but I'll still give it a full star.
Fair enough.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think a full star just because you got to one of those things you got to watch. I already gave my reasonings. So I've complained a lot about Netflix adding in fluff because they want to increase watch time.
Yeah.
This feels like that. This really does feel like that. And like I said, I love long movies. If you bring me, I loved Lord of the Rings director's cut. Love it. Just put me in that world because they're able to make a compelling characters and story, and actually keep going with the story and not have weird tangents that don't matter. Like, okay, like the guy in Hollywood with the horse in the head in the bed, like it's iconic. But like it has no bearing on the story whatsoever. It literally has nothing. Nothing comes of it later on.
You know what's funny?
Getting hit.
It's proof of something that was previously stated, right? Like it's a payoff to the idea of the story that Michael told at the wedding, where Michael's like, "Oh, my father made him an offer he can't refuse," right? And then he said, "Well, what was that offer?" And it's like, "Well," Kay asked, "Right, what was the offer?" And he's like, "Well, Luca Brasi held a gun to his head and he said, your brains or your signature are going to be on this paper by the time we leave this room." Well, it's a compelling offer. And then this is just the payoff to that. But you're right, it doesn't add anything because we already heard the story. So it's like it's just that story again. Only we get to see it instead of be told it.
For Frank Sinatra knockoff.
Yep. No, Paul, that's not Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra never had any connections to the mob. What are you talking
Frank Sinatra.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, surprising absolutely nobody. I'm going to give this a full star as well. This is definitely one of those movies that you really should watch, if only so that you know what everybody else is talking about.
Yep.
But it is worth watching in its own right, in my opinion. And like it is almost Shakespearean in its tragedy storytelling, and I kind of like the length of it. Like I like how long it is. It gives you time to ponder and digest the things that are being presented to you, and I honestly appreciate that, especially for this movie. Please do watch it.
Yeah. All right. So that's it for our discussion of Godfather. But if you are a supporter of the show on Patreon or Subscribestar, stick around and we're going to do some bonus content. We're going to answer a question. I think I've got a plan here that actually kind of connects into this a little bit, but it's actually about the question came from our live stream conversation about Arcane, which we talked about a little bit on Discord. So one of the things that listeners should know is that we are currently trying to do weekly conversations. It started out as being conversations on Boba Fett, but because Boba Fett was kind of boring until the last couple episodes, we kind of shifted gears a little bit.
Disagree.
See, Paul's like, all of Boba Fett until episode 5 or whatever was filler. So here we are. But Paul's okay with that.
The Godfather of Star Wars.
He's not okay with Michael Corleone hanging out in Italy for 2 hours. But anyway, we're getting on Discord, and this is available for everybody. So even if you're not a supporter on Patreon or Subscribestar, you're welcome to join Discord. You're welcome to join our email list. And of course, please check us out on social media. Follow us, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Got new Out of Frame episodes coming up every 2 weeks. Shorts. I'm trying to do shorts like once a week, maybe twice a week, depending on how many I can get done. And we're having a good time on all the social media. So check us out everywhere else. And thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.